Made with love by Indigrow.
My background is that I am the daughter of a Japanese immigrant father who came to the US when he was 15 on an exchange program that was set up between his school in Tokyo and a school in New Hampshire, where the parents had lost their son in World War II, an American fighting in the Pacific theater. And so they wanted to make sure that that never happened again, that we had fundamental understanding across cultures. So that's how my dad came to the US. And so he came as sort of a bridge between cultures. So I think it's fitting, in a lot of ways, the work that I do now, because it is looking for the bridge between us, right, as humans. And so my mother is white from Seattle. So, I grew up at a time where being biracial was not as common. And I grew up very much in both cultures, right? Like the Japanese culture was very strong in my household, and my dad was the only family member to come from Japan. So we would go back to Japan, and it was very, my first name, it was made up, but it has Japanese characters, and all Japanese think it's American, and all Americans think, I'm Eastern European. So it's not exactly what they had designed. Then I grew up in America, right? So very much understanding the American culture, but being biracial, it's very, people want to fit you into a box very early on, right? Are you white? Are you Asian broadly, or Japanese specifically? And I was never Japanese enough or never white enough. And so I think having your identity questioned really early on leads you to be very strong in your own identity, because you recognize that everyone's going to try and fit you in somewhere you don't belong. So you have to create your own space for belonging. And so, I think, I've carried that with me. It has been sort of fundamentally first in, going to law school was related to the fact that I wanted to make sure that people who didn't have a voice could have a voice. And that's what I do in my work now, to make sure that people whose voices have largely been left out of the history of our country, those voices are heard and considered, and not only considered, but that they're included in the story of our country going forward. I married my husband in 2010, and he's a Black American from Louisiana. So my kids are super mixed race. They're Black, Japanese, and white. They have Japanese first names, very unique ones. So they're also mispronounced a lot. And so they're not even common Japanese names. And so everyone's kind of like, what? And so, but they are much better than I was, because I let people mispronounce my name for years, and would not correct them. So I understand what you were saying when, it's only been fairly recently. And I'm like, no, this is my name. And I know you can say this. But they are very good at it. They will say, no, that's not how you say it. And they'll repeat it for people. So I feel good in that they are stronger in who they are, perhaps, than even I was when I was younger. A lot of the work that I do now is centered around the world that I would like my kids to live in. Part of raising Black sons in America is that I have a very real fear that they walk out of our house one day and not come back, right? Solely based on the color of their skin. And that is a devastating fear for a parent, because what do we do as parents? We want to keep our kids safe, right? And I cannot do that in the way that I would like, based on the history of our country and systemic racism. So, the work that I do, and I do this work on the Dear White Woman platform with my best friend of 25 years, who's also biracial. It's designed, to recognize, to tell people who are part of the dominant narrative in this country, which largely includes, which is white people, but we're talking specifically to white women, because of the power and influence that women have in society, which is largely undervalued. And, even as our rights are being taken away from us in this country, like, we are stronger together. And so when my boys walk out of our house, they're in everyone else's hands, right? Except mine. And they're often in the hands of the kids of the white women that we are talking to, right? Mm-hmm. So how do we teach kids who have the privilege of not having this conversation at home, right? About how to stay safe when you're facing the police, about what happens if you're called a racial slur. How do we get those kids to stand up, to be those upstanders for my kids and kids who look like them. And so it is really tied to empathy and humanity and seeing the commonalities that we share. So a lot of what we do is talk to parents, right? Because if we have the same goals for our kids, we need to make sure that we're having those same goals for all kids, right? And so, and coming from a space of being biracial and not fitting in and feeling like the other and being othered, I think gives me the ability to have this lens for this work, because not only do I think I can help my kids being multiracial, right, where they're not going to fit in even more than I didn't fit in, right? They've got, they're checking all the boxes, they're checking a lot of boxes. But also, how do we have this conversation in a way that is respectful and empathetic and looks at the growing reality of our country and our world, that we are moving towards a multi-ethnic world in many different ways that was inconceivable several generations ago. So how do we talk to kids about this? How do we get adults to get over their discomfort around these conversations, because we might not have had them growing up, and make sure that, maybe not for my kids, but my kids' won't have the same fear, right, of their kids walking out of the house, right? That we can get to a collective future that's better for everyone, not just for certain individuals.
The Dear White Women platform, is it at the moment a book? Is it an ecosystem? Is it different ways of reaching out to parents and educating them and helping them in this journey?
Yes, so it is. So it started as a podcast, actually. So we've had a podcast for over 3 years. And it's a weekly podcast. So the podcast and the book are kind of premised on the same 3 pillars, which is listen, learn, and act. So we really, on the podcast, sometimes it's Sarah and me interviewing people whose stories are typically not told in sort of the history books in our schools, throughout our country. So we want people, especially people who live in very segregated communities, because in America we do have so many communities that are sort of still segregated by race, so that you hear other people's stories, because like you were mentioning at the start too, stories really have that impact in sort of opening people's worlds, and finding those links, right, to humanity and empathy. And then we do, part of the work that we do is teaching people the history that we didn't learn in schools, right? That we are still fighting over in the US about whether or not it's even going to be included in textbooks. And so we want to make sure that what we now know is the true history of this country, and how different groups of people have been marginalized throughout this history. We want to give that knowledge to adults and parents in particular, so that you can ask those questions in your kids' schools. Like, well, what's being taught? Why are we not doing anything for Black History Month, right? Why are we only talking about Black people in Black History Month? Another question. And basically, not only equipping you with the tools to talk to your kids at home, but also giving you the tools to ask, to be critical thinkers, right, in today's society, and to ask the questions that people would like you to not ask, I think, because it's easier to not ask at times. And then act, right, like with the stories that you now know, and the history and the politics and all of that. What can you do in your own spheres of influence? Kids being a big one, school being a big one, work, home, all of those things, book clubs. How can you make small changes, right, so that we can get closer to that ideal of the collective good, right, and all of us rising together, right, rather than just some of us? Because if it's some of us, then it's really none of us. And so part of the work that the book has that structure in it too. And then we do a lot of speaking. We do speaking in companies, but my personal favorite is speaking to parents, speaking to schools, and speaking to school districts, because it is, I think for people in our generations, sometimes it's harder to change minds, or it's harder to find those tied to humanity, because especially right now in the US, we are so divided. But kids, right? Kids have that they are not there yet. They have that ability, as we were talking about, to see fairness and justice and be like, no, that's wrong. Why would we treat someone differently because of the color of their skin? Like, why would we treat someone differently because they use different pronouns? And I think that talking to groups that can directly influence that generation gives me a lot of hope. So that's what I love doing.
It's so pleasurable, isn't it? So every time we're, writing up a new character, we're in the middle of creating a book we call Toko's How We Look Playbook, People Around the World. So it's a story about Toko, who's a toucan, and Toko sort of points out differences. And then, they go on this little journey and they meet people of different backgrounds. And, everyone has a little story, being teased about their eyes or like the color of their skin or their hair or, different ways they look based on their physical features. And then they're all kind of learning, but the book comes with little activities and, empowering phrases that you can use and sort of ways of having these conversations with your kids. And it's so wonderful when we're doing a little bit of research to dock that point with a child. And then you see sort of like it docked. And then when you see that, you're like, oh my gosh, this is so amazing that this is going to live with this child, because they're going to remember this little character. And hopefully that's one mind opened and one heart opened and one connection. Yeah. On that point, was there any impactful experience, both positive or negative, that you had growing up that inspired you to do this?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking about this the other day because I have my kids are now 8 and 9, so they're heading into 3rd and 5th grade. And I was trying to think of when I had like those memories of school or, being made to feel different, because someone else had asked me a similar question recently. And I remember in 4th grade, and we were learning about US history, and it was World War II. And prior to that point, I had thought like, naively, like kids do, like, oh, well, everyone else has sort of a second culture, or, like I go to Japan every summer, that I'm sure everyone, goes and does things with their family. And I realized, that was not the case very quickly, because we were having this discussion about Pearl Harbor, right? And the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And I remember a boy turning to me and saying like, this was, so your family did this kind of thing. And I was like, but like, A, he didn't know my family's story, which was very much that my family didn't want to do that at all. But B, it's like, I'm an American. Like, what are we talking about here? And I just remember in that moment, and, other kids turn and look, and you just feel like, I don't know, it was, there's moments of othering, and then there are moments of like really othering. And I felt like in all of those moments where he chose to make it very personal, about, me, based on just very superficial things that he knew about me, which was, my last name is Suzuki, like, and yeah, those were those moments where I was like, this shouldn't be a conversation that we're having like this, because we should have had conversations a lot earlier about various things. Of course, that's like what the adult me thinks about at the time, but the fourth grader me was so like ashamed of, that was part of my family's history, and so mortified that I was being called out in class, because I was always sort of the quiet, head down, like very good student, not trying to make any waves. Yeah, it was one of those moments that clearly I haven't forgotten, but it's very formative in thinking about, how do I want kids to treat other kids? Like, how do we not have that happen to other kids? And in so many ways. And it's, so that was one of those for me, I think. And for my kids, there have, there's a couple of stories that relate to my kids. And I think one of them is when my husband had taken my older son to the park, because I was super pregnant with my younger son, and was not going to the park at that point to like chase kids down the slide. And this white woman, had come over to him. And this is in the area that we still live in, which is like a fairly well-off suburb area outside of, in the Bay Area. And she looked at him and she said, oh, do you live by here? And he was like, who is this lady, first of all, asking me questions? And he was like, well, he's like, yeah. And she's like, oh, like, where do you live? And he was like, look, basically in his head, like, look, lady, like, I'm not giving you all this personal information. He's like, around here. And she was like, oh, just because, we never, we come here a lot. And she's gesturing to her friends. And she's like, and we've just never seen you here before. So like, and the clear message was like, you don't belong here.
Yeah.
And so she's going on about this. Her friends now, meanwhile, have like just kind of like shuffled the other way, because I think they're just like, look, I don't know what's happening here. And so finally, at one point, she's still going on, and he's like, okay. And he looks at her and he says, oh, so you know everyone around here. I guess you must be the park ranger. And that sort of stopped her from talking and like sent her back. But it has been that experience, or me being asked, if I'm the nanny of my boys at the park. And I was like, that says a lot about the fact that these couldn't be my biological children, right? Even though I remember exactly how long I was in labor with both of them, right? Or, right, yeah, those weren't easy births. And then, or mom's trying to touch my younger son's hair, because he used to have sort of these big sort of afro curls. And just reaching out to touch his hair, like he's kind of a zoo animal. And I was, again, like, and that's when full like mama bear comes out, like, what are you doing? Just these moments of, and I can see it in this sort of the nonverbal othering then too, right? And yeah, I just, and I'm thinking, like, if this mom is, saying this to my husband and she's got her kids there, or if this mom is, asking me if I'm a nanny and she's got her kids there, right? Or if this mom is trying to touch my son's hair and she's got her kids there, what are they learning? Right?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it doesn't have to be a specific lesson told to them. It's what they see and observe, because kids are like sponges, they especially see all the things you don't want them to see.
Yeah.
And so those moments were very formative for me too, in thinking like, this is a fight that is much bigger than me or even my specific kids, right? If we are going to make things better, like, how do we do that? And who do we need, which is everyone. So yeah, those are those moments.
One of the things we get a lot is, I don't need to have these conversations with my kids, they're too young. Or I don't need to have these conversations with my kids, I'm not biracial. You don't want to be the parent or a caregiver of a child who gets called out or bullied, but you also don't want to be the parent of a child who picks on someone else, right? You don't want either of those. Diversity is not sort of a section in the bookshelf anymore, right? It's what we live every day. It's what our kids live every day. And it's a much more diverse world than, what we grew up in. But these experiences are happening now to our kids as we live. Do you think people actually believe that in the majority, first of all? Do you feel like in the US or in the world in general, that thought process is changing and you see a shift? And if so, or if not, then how early do you think these conversations need to start? And what can we do as parents and educators on a more everyday basis?
That's a great question. I would like to believe that people think it is changing, but I think it really depends on what personally affects you, right? Like I think there are still many communities in the US, and there's still many communities throughout the world that are very homogenous. And so if that's not part of your daily life, you have the privilege of not addressing it, right? And, because to your point earlier, where you were talking about frustrations with parents saying like, oh, well, I'm not sure why this is needed. I've had white parents ask me, why is it important? I don't want to traumatize my, insert age here, 7-year-old daughter, let's say, because this is an actual example, by talking to her about racism. I don't want to traumatize her. So I was like, okay, so you're telling me, the mother of Black sons, that you don't want to traumatize your white daughter by not talking to her about racism. And I was like, well, so let's just recognize that is a privilege, right? That you feel like you do not have to have this conversation, because we do at home, and that is about survival. And we talk about it, I want them to come home every day. And I think that the thing is, this is a conversation that as parents, we have the ability to impart our views and our beliefs on our kids, right? And much like sex, right? Or talking to our kids about safety or bullies or anything, those are conversations we typically want to control, right? We don't want our kids to just run into that first situation, or depending on if we've waited so long, right, to have social media teach our kids, or, you know, whoever is at school with our kids or sharing, they're going to be the first to impart their beliefs on our kids. And I think as parents, it should be our goal, right, to be the first people to have those conversations. And I think people get afraid to have those conversations because they didn't grow up with those conversations themselves. Like I said, like their first memories of thinking about things like race or sexuality or whatever were probably being told by an adult figure, right? We don't talk about that, you know, and so we don't point out the person in the wheelchair, or we don't talk about how this boy's skin color is different than mine. And I think that's doing a disservice to our kids, right? Because we do live in a society where we have so many different people. So I'm not saying we have to go through, like, if you live in the US, the full history of slavery when your child is 5. But I am saying that when we say things like, I don't see color, your kids are absolutely seeing color. So there are so many different resources out there. It sounds like you're providing such a great tools to parents, but there are books, there are media, and there are ways to have discussions. And I really like the question, or the statement, I notice, right? Like, what do you notice when you're reading this book with your kid? What do they notice? What do you notice in your communities? What do you notice in media? And sometimes it's you notice the absence of something. Sometimes you notice the presence of something, but that also reinforces the critical thinking skills that our kids are really going to need, because we encourage that in school and we stop encouraging that as adults. And now we're not even encouraging it in school as much. And so I think that to be these global citizens, to be able to see and empathize with the humanity in others, we have to encourage those from the start.
Just being in the
yes.
of this community, you see a lot, right? You see a lot of new books every day, and there are, you know, there's some beautiful, beautiful stories being told. What do you think is actually missing? Is it the scaling of these? Is it trying to convince parents who are not convinced?
Yeah, so I think there's still a concept, if your story is the dominant narrative in your country, right, that you are somehow outside of whatever problem there is, right? Racism or sexism or you know, gender identity or sexuality. That you're kind of coming in as the helper, right? So you have a choice whether to help or not. And I would argue that that's a convenient explanation for why you feel like you don't need to get involved, but that's not the actual truth. The truth of the matter is that whatever systems are in place in our countries have been there for a long time. They actually hurt everyone when we are not able to recognize people as their full global citizens, full citizens of our country, have the full rights as everyone else, because that always leaves questions of power and control. And I'm pretty certain that, to your point earlier, that parents don't want their kids to be that bully, their kids to be that oppressor. You know, here we had with George Floyd's murder, which was so public, you know, in America, no one wants their son or daughter to be that police officer, right? But if we don't talk to them early about this, and you as a parent are not participating in that conversation, then you're just leaving it up to whatever, right? And just hoping that that's not going to happen. And I think that a lot of people have done that for a long time and it hasn't helped anything. So how do we get people whose rights, who may feel like their rights haven't been taken away, or who feel like that sacrificing something isn't worth it for the collective good? Like, how do we get them there? And I think you think about the future for your kids and who do you really want your kid to be? And as parents, we have so much control over that, especially when they're young, right? Because when they're older, and they leave our house for longer periods of time, and then they, may move out. Hopefully, I hope my kids move out for college. But then we're not their primary influence anymore. And so we have this small window of time, right, where we can be those teachers. We can shape that generation differently than how, when we think about all the ways in which we wished our parents would have talked to us about certain things, we can do that now. We have that agency.
Yeah.
So let's not waste it.
I hope you enjoyed this video. Visit us at integrowkids.com for more.